frost had already blackened the dead leaves when the deadbolt clicked locked. 34-year-old Jacob Miller stood on the porch with nothing but a canvas duffel bag and fractured ribs. Winter was 30 days away, and he had absolutely nowhere to go. Survival wasn't a choice, it was mandatory. Family blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in Jacob's case, it froze a lot faster. Just 3 months after their mother, Martha, passed away, the family home in the rugged foothills of West Virginia became a battleground. Jacob had spent the last 2 years caring for her, draining his modest savings as a carpenter, while simultaneously dealing with medical debts from a brutal scaffolding fall that had left him with 3 cracked ribs and a permanent limp. His older brother, Thomas, a man who had barely visited for a decade, swooped in with a team of lawyers. Thomas exploited a loophole in an outdated will, claiming sole ownership of the property. On a bitter Tuesday in late October, the sheriff's deputy stood by as Thomas tossed Jacob's bags off the porch. "You're not my responsibility anymore, Jacob," Thomas had said, his voice as cold as the autumn wind blowing down from the Appalachians. "Figure it out." With $50 in his pocket, a folding cam shovel, an axe, a heavy wool blanket, and a bag of dry rice, Jacob walked away. Town was 15 miles in the wrong direction, and he knew he couldn't afford a single night in a motel anyway. He needed shelter, and he needed it before the November frosts turned lethal. Walking deep into the dense, forgotten tracts of public timberland bordering the county line, Jacob remembered a specific topography from his youth. There was a steep south-facing embankment overlooking an old, dried-up creek bed. A south-facing slope in the northern hemisphere is a survivalist's holy grail. It catches the maximum amount of winter sunlight, naturally warming the earth. By the time he reached the embankment, the sun was dipping below the tree line, plunging the woods into a biting chill. He had no tent. That first night, he slept under a mound of dry pine needles, shivering so violently his injured ribs screamed in agony. When dawn broke, pale and gray, he knew if he didn't secure a thermal shelter, he would be dead in a week. He wasn't going to build a cabin. He didn't have the tools, the time, or the calories. He was going to build a dugout. He was going to bury himself alive to stay warm. The digging began. For 5 agonizing days, Jacob attacked the side of the hill with his small folding shovel and his bare hands. The soil was dense, packed with glacial rocks and thick, stubborn roots. Every swing of the shovel sent shockwaves of pain through his chest. He dug a cavern 6 feet deep into the hill, 8 feet wide and 5 feet high. It was grueling, back-breaking labor. His hands blistered, bled, and calloused over. He lived on handfuls of cold rice soaked in creek water and the sheer burning spite of proving his brother wrong. But a simple dirt hole wasn't enough. The earth is a great insulator, maintaining a constant temperature of around 50 degrees below the frost line, but exposed soil walls would crumble and seep freezing moisture the moment the snow melted. He needed to engineer a lining. Down in the creek bed, beneath a layer of dead leaves, Jacob found veins of thick gray clay. It was heavy and sticky. Working with a frantic energy, he hauled dozens of loads of the heavy clay up the hill in his duffel bag. Next, he harvested hundreds of bundles of dry, dead switchgrass and goldenrod from a nearby meadow. Channeling his carpentry skills and historical survival techniques, Jacob began to create a rudimentary wattle and daub. He mixed the wet clay with the dry straw, stomping it with his boots until it formed a thick, cohesive mortar. The straw acted like rebar, giving the clay structural integrity, while the trapped air inside the hollow grass stems provided incredible thermal insulation. He plastered this mixture 2 inches thick directly onto the dirt walls of his dugout. It took 3 more days of exhausting work, his fingernails caked in gray mud, his muscles trembling from a severe calorie deficit. But as the clay straw mixture dried into a hardened, cement-like shell, the transformation was miraculous. The damp, earthy smell was replaced by a dry, neutral scent. The shelter was sealed. For the roof, Jacob felled several straight cedar saplings with his axe, laying them across the top of the dugout like rafters. He wove a tight lattice of pine boughs over the timber, then piled on a foot of dry leaves, and finally capped the entire structure with a massive layer of the excavated dirt, packing it down tight. To the untrained eye, looking down from the top of the hill, there was nothing there, just a natural mound in the forest floor. The final touch was ventilation and heat. He dug a small Dakota fire hole near the entrance, a two-chambered pit that draws fresh air from a side tunnel, creating a smokeless, incredibly hot fire. He fashioned a chimney pipe out of a hollowed-out birch log lined with more clay, venting it out the side of the embankment. On November 12th, the first true blizzard hit West Virginia. Outside, the temperature plummeted to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, dropping a foot of snow in hours. Jacob sat inside his shelter, his back pressed against the hardened clay wall. He struck a match and lit a small handful of dry twigs in his fire hole. Within 20 minutes, the magic of thermal mass took over. The clay and earth absorbed the heat from the small fire and radiated it back into the tiny room. The straw insulation prevented the cold from the deep earth from penetrating inward. Jacob watched in awe as his breath, which had been pluming in white clouds, vanished. He took off his heavy jacket. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt. It was 65 degrees inside the dugout. Outside, it was a lethal, freezing hell. He lay back on a bed of woven pine branches and, for the first time in months, slept soundly. For the next 6 weeks, Jacob became a ghost of the woods. He survived by snaring rabbits with wire from an old fence, foraging late-season acorns, and melting snow for water. He was entirely off the grid, buried in the earth, warm and alive. The shelter never dropped below 45 degrees, even on days when he didn't light a fire. The earth was holding him in a protective embrace. But isolation plays tricks on the mind, and the real twist of Jacob's survival story wasn't man versus nature. It was man versus man. On Christmas Eve, a freak polar vortex swept down from Canada. The local radio broadcasts had Jacob possessed a radio, were warning residents to stay indoors at all costs. The wind chill was hitting 20 below zero. The snow was falling so thick it looked like a wall of static. Jacob was safely tucked in his dugout, roasting a snared rabbit over a bed of glowing coals, reading an old paperback by the firelight. Around 9 p.m., he heard something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, metallic crunch of a heavy vehicle impacting a tree, followed by the agonizing whine of a failing engine, and then dead silence. The sound had come from the old, unplowed logging road about a quarter-mile above his embankment. Jacob hesitated. Going out into a 20 below whiteout was suicide. If he got lost in the dark, he would freeze in minutes. But the human instinct to help overrode his logic. He wrapped his wool blanket around his shoulders, grabbed his axe and a makeshift pine pitch torch, and pushed out the heavy wooden door of his dugout into the screaming storm. The snow was up to his thighs. He fought his way up the hill, leaning into wind that felt like broken glass against his face. When he finally reached the logging road, his torch illuminated a horrific sight. A silver Ford F-150 had skidded off the icy track, slamming head-on into a massive oak. The hood was crumpled, the windshield shattered. Jacob waded through the snowdrift to the driver's side door. It was jammed. He wiped the snow from the side window and peered inside. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious, a vicious gash on his forehead bleeding sluggishly in the cold. Jacob raised his axe and smashed the side window, reaching in to unlock the door. He pried it open with all his remaining strength. He reached in to grab the man's shoulder, pulling him back against the seat to check his pulse. The torchlight fell across the driver's pale, bloody face. Jacob stopped breathing. It was Thomas, his brother, the man who had thrown him into the street to die. The universe had a sick, twisted sense of humor. Thomas, likely out checking the property lines or attempting to take a shortcut to a holiday party, had met the very winter he had condemned Jacob to. A dark, vengeful thought crossed Jacob's mind. Walk away. He left you to freeze. Let the cold take him. It would be so easy. He could turn around, go back to his 70-degree dirt bunker, and eat his roasted rabbit. Thomas let out a shallow, rattling gasp. His lips were blue. Hypothermia was shutting his organs down. Jacob cursed into the wind. He couldn't do it. He wasn't the killer, and he wasn't his brother. Hauling a 200-pound unconscious man through a blizzard was the hardest physical task Jacob ever endured. He dragged Thomas by the armpits, slipping, falling, his cracked ribs blazing with white-hot pain. The quarter-mile took nearly 45 minutes. By the time they reached the dugout, Jacob was in the early stages of hypothermia himself, his vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. He shoved Thomas through the small doorway, collapsing onto the dirt floor behind him. Jacob scrambled to seal the door against the wind, then frantically fed wood into the fire hole until flames roared up the clay chimney. He stripped Thomas out of his wet, freezing coat and wrapped him in the heavy wool blanket, dragging him right next to the radiant clay wall. Jacob sat on the opposite side, panting, watching his brother's chest rise and fall. It took 3 hours for Thomas to wake up. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, he was disoriented. He looked up at the ceiling of cedar poles and packed earth, then at the gray, smooth clay walls glowing orange in the firelight. The air was incredibly warm, smelling of wood smoke and dry grass. Then he saw Jacob sitting across from him, holding a tin cup of hot, melted snow. "You," Thomas croaked, his voice raw. He touched the dried blood on his forehead. "Am I dead?" "No," Jacob said quietly. "But you were about 20 minutes away from it." Thomas slowly sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. He looked around the meticulously crafted dugout, the hardened clay insulation, the smokeless fire, the sheer survivalist brilliance of it all. He realized he was deep underground. I assumed you went to the city shelter," Thomas whispered, shame finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "I thought you were gone." "I was here," Jacob replied, taking a sip from his cup. "Right where you left me." Thomas looked at the dirt floor, tears welling in his eyes. The realization of what he had done and what Jacob had achieved crushed him. He had kicked his crippled brother out to die, and in return, his brother had carved a fortress out of the very dirt to survive, and then used that fortress to save his life. "I'm sorry," Thomas sobbed, breaking down completely in the warmth of the underground room. "Jacob, I'm so sorry. The house, it's yours. Half of it, all of it, whatever you want. I was greedy, I was wrong." Jacob didn't smile. He didn't offer a hug. The betrayal was too deep for a quick fix. But as he looked at his brother, shivering despite the 80-degree heat radiating from the clay walls, he felt the heavy burden of anger finally lift from his chest. They stayed in the dugout for 2 more days, until the blizzard passed and the county plows finally cleared the main roads. When they emerged, climbing out of the hillside into the blinding white sunlight, the world felt entirely different. Thomas kept his word. He signed half the deed back to Jacob the following week, but Jacob didn't move back into the main house right away. Sometimes, when the modern world felt too loud, too cruel, and too unpredictable, Jacob would walk the 15 miles back to the public timberland. He would climb down into the earth, light a small fire in the Dakota hole, and lean against the hardened clay walls, finding comfort in the shelter that had saved him from the winter and saved his brother from himself. Nature doesn't care about your bank account or your family drama, but it will reward ingenuity and grit. Jacob's story proves that sometimes the greatest warmth comes from the coldest earth. If you found this real-life survival story inspiring, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales of human resilience. Stay safe out there.